Texas, 1943. Inside a crude wooden chapel at Camp Hereford, an Italian prisoner of war named Luigi Capini stood before bare plaster walls, a paintbrush trembling in his hands. He had crossed an ocean as an enemy soldier. Now he was being asked to paint the Virgin Mary. The camp chaplain watched from the doorway, uncertain whether this was pastoral care or a violation of War Department regulations. Neither man knew it yet. But what would happen here, in a dozen prison camps across Texas, would trigger investigations, congressional inquiries, and a quiet battle over whether art could exist inside the machinery of war. The trains rolled into Texas in the summer of 1943, carrying men who had fought for Mussolini across North Africa. Italian prisoners of war, 50,000 of them, bound for camps scattered across the American Southwest. They arrived expecting brutality. Instead, they found something more confusing, indifference mixed with strange kindness. The heat hit them first. Not the dry Mediterranean heat they knew, but something heavier, more relentless. At Camp Hereford, near the Oklahoma border, dust hung in the air like smoke. The prisoners stumbled off cattle cars, blinking in the white sun, their uniforms stained with sweat and travel. Guards shouted in English they barely understood. The horizon stretched endlessly in all directions, empty and alien. Among them was Luigi Capini, 28 years old, from a village near Florence. Before the war, he had painted frescoes in country churches, mixed pigments in his father's studio, learned the old techniques passed down through generations. Now his hands bore calluses from soldiering, his lungs still raw from the desert campaigns. He expected hard labor. He expected punishment. He did not expect what came next. The camp spread across flat grassland, rows of tar paper barracks, guard towers, miles of wire. But there was also a chapel, small, hastily built from scrap lumber and corrugated tin, but unmistakably a chapel. Father Gerald O'Connor, the camp chaplain, had insisted on it. The War Department permitted religious services for prisoners, though barely. The building was functional, nothing more. Inside, the walls were raw plaster, cracked and gray. Father O'Connor was 43 from Boston, with a face weathered by Texas sun, and a quiet frustration with bureaucracy. He had served in the First World War, knew what captivity did to men's souls. He also knew that prisoners needed something beyond survival. They needed meaning. He noticed Capini during Mass. The Italian had crossed himself properly, lips moving in Latin prayers. Afterward, O'Connor approached through an interpreter, a corporal from Brooklyn who spoke broken Italian learned from his grandmother. "You know the liturgy," O'Connor said. Capini nodded. "From childhood, Father." "Were you religious before the war?" "My family painted churches." The chaplain went still. Around them, prisoners filed back to their barracks, boots scuffing in dust. "Painted churches?" "Frescoes, murals. My father, his father before him." O'Connor glanced at the chapel's bare walls. An idea formed, dangerous and irresistible. "Could you paint these walls?" The question hung between them like something illicit. Capini looked at the interpreter, uncertain he had understood correctly. "Paint them? Make them beautiful, for worship." The Italian's hands began to tremble, not from fear, but from something he had not felt in years: purpose. "I have no materials, Father. No pigments, no brushes. I'll find them." O'Connor's voice carried a certainty that surprised even himself. "If you can paint, I'll find what you need." That evening, Capini lay in his bunk and stared at the ceiling. Around him, men snored or whispered in Italian, their voices carrying memories of home. He had not held a paintbrush in 3 years. His fingers had forgotten the delicate pressure, the way pigment flows and settles. But the images were still there, locked behind his eyes. The Virgin's serene face, the angels in their hierarchies, the saints with their symbols and stories. For the first time since his capture, he felt something other than emptiness. Father O'Connor worked through channels that barely existed. The War Department had regulations for feeding prisoners, housing them, working them in the cotton fields. Nothing about art supplies. He wrote letters to church organizations, to supply officers, to anyone who might understand why a prison camp chapel needed beauty. Meanwhile, word spread through the camp. Copini was not alone. In Barrack 7, a man named Antonio Falcone had studied at the Academy of Fine Arts in Rome before the war drafted him. At Camp McLean, near Amarillo, there was Guglielmo Barberis, a commercial artist who had painted advertisements and theater backdrops. At Fort Bliss outside El Paso, Pietro Bugatti sketched portraits in charcoal on scraps of paper, trading them for cigarettes. The Italian prisoners lived in a strange limbo. They were not mistreated. The guards were mostly older men, bored and counting days until rotation home. The food was adequate, sometimes generous. Prisoners worked in surrounding farms, picking cotton or repairing fences, and farmers often brought them cold water, sometimes sandwiches. Nothing like the propaganda they had been fed about American cruelty. This confused them. They had expected camps like those in Europe, brutal, dehumanizing. Instead, they found themselves in a vast, empty landscape where the war felt distant and unreal. Some broke under the isolation. Others found strange comfort in it. For Copini, the confusion deepened when Father O'Connor returned one morning with supplies. Not professional artist materials. Those were impossible to obtain during wartime rationing, but house paint, industrial brushes, cans of pigment, meant for farm buildings. Also, miraculously, a set of charcoal pencils and several yards of canvas drop cloth. "It's what I could get," O'Connor said, almost apologetic. Copini held a brush, testing its weight. The bristles were coarse, meant for whitewashing barns, not painting sacred faces. But his hands remembered. They knew how to adapt, how to work with whatever materials existed. "This will work, Father." The chaplain also brought sketches torn from Catholic magazines, images of saints, biblical scenes, traditional compositions. "I thought you might need references." Copini studied them with the quiet intensity of a man rediscovering a lost language. That afternoon, he stood before the chapel's east wall and began to sketch in charcoal. The other prisoners watched from the doorway, silent, as the first faint lines appeared. The outline of an altar, the suggestion of figures, the geometry of sacred space. Antonio Falcone appeared beside him. "You need help." Copini glanced sideways. "You paint?" "In Rome. Before. This is different from Rome." Everything is different from Rome. They worked in silence, two men who had not painted in years, their muscles remembering motions their minds had half forgotten. The house paint was thick and stubborn, requiring constant thinning. The brushes left crude strokes, but slowly, impossibly, images emerged from the gray plaster. News traveled through the camp network, the invisible communication system that exists wherever men are confined together. At other camps, chaplains heard about Hereford. Some dismissed it as foolishness, others saw possibility. At Camp McLean, Father Thomas McKenna was younger, more idealistic. He found Guglielmo Barberis working in the camp laundry, hands red from harsh soap. "I hear you painted before the war." Barberis looked up, suspicious. "Who told you this?" "Does it matter?" The Italian wrung out a shirt, water dripping onto concrete. "I painted advertisements, cigarette posters, nothing important." "Could you paint something important now?" The question seemed cruel. Barberis gestured at the laundry tubs, the industrial washing machines, the steam and chemical smell. "Here? With what?" But McKenna had already been working connections, writing letters, calling in favors from church groups. Within weeks, supplies arrived, minimal, improvised, but enough. And Barberis found himself standing in McLean's bare chapel, staring at empty walls, feeling something he thought the war had killed: anticipation. At Fort Bliss, Pietro Bugatti was more reluctant. He had watched men die in North Africa, had seen things that made beauty seem obscene. When the camp chaplain approached him, he refused. "I don't paint anymore, Father." "Why not?" "Because it doesn't matter. Nothing matters." The chaplain, Father Raymond Walsh, was old enough to have buried men in the previous war. He understood despair. Maybe it doesn't matter, but maybe it's all that matters. Bugatti turned away, but that night, lying in his bunk, he found himself sketching on a scrap of cardboard. Just lines, meaningless geometry. His hands moved without permission, tracing shapes that had no name. The next morning, he told Father Walsh he would try. The work began across Texas, in camps scattered from the Panhandle to the Rio Grande. Italian prisoners, trained artists and skilled amateurs, began transforming crude military chapels into something unexpected. They painted in the hours after work details, in the cooling evenings when the sun finally released its grip, in the strange, suspended time of captivity where days blurred together without meaning. Father O'Connor watched Copini work at Hereford and saw something beyond decoration. The Italian moved along the wall with absolute focus, mixing pigments, testing colors, building up layers with patience that seemed impossible in a prison camp. Other prisoners began gathering to watch, sitting silently in the chapel pews, smoking quietly, not speaking. "Why do they come?" O'Connor asked the interpreter one evening. The corporal watched the prisoners, their faces lit by the setting sun through the chapel's small windows. "It reminds them they're still human, Father, that they're not just numbers and work details." On the wall, the Virgin Mary's face emerged slowly, stroke by careful stroke. Copini used the crude house paint like expensive pigment, layering and blending, creating depth from flatness. Her expression was neither joyful nor sorrowful, something between, something that held both sorrow and peace. "She looks sad," O'Connor observed. Copini stepped back, brush in hand. "All mothers of soldiers are sad, Father." By autumn, the chapel at Camp Hereford had changed completely. What had been raw plaster was now covered with images, biblical scenes rendered in the Italian tradition, but adapted to the materials and circumstances of a Texas prison camp. The colors were muted, limited by what house paint could achieve, but the compositions were classical, echoing centuries of European sacred art. Above the altar, Copini had painted the crucifixion, not the agonized version common in modern churches, but something older, more Byzantine. Christ's face was calm, accepting, his body not tortured but dignified in suffering. On the side walls, the Stations of the Cross proceeded in careful sequence. Near the entrance, St. Francis blessed animals that looked suspiciously like Texas cattle. The chapel became something more than a building. Prisoners came even when there was no service, sitting quietly, looking at the walls. American guards began visiting too, curious at first, then genuinely moved. The art created a space that transcended the war, not by denying it, but by asserting that something existed beyond it. Word spread beyond the camps. Local townspeople heard about the Italian artists and wanted to see. Father O'Connor received permission for supervised visits. On Sunday afternoons, families from Hereford drove out to the camp, parking outside the wire, walking through the guarded gate to the chapel. They came expecting curiosity, enemy soldiers doing strange things. They found beauty that made them quiet. Farm wives stood before the images and wept, thinking of sons serving overseas. Old men who had fought in the First War sat in the pews and stared, remembering their own captivity, their own survival. A local reporter wrote a small piece for the Amarillo newspaper. "Italian Artists Beautify Camp Chapel." The article was modest, respectful, noting the peculiarity of the situation. Enemies creating sacred art in captivity. It mentioned Father O'Connor's initiative, the prisoner's skill, the strange grace of the project. That article was noticed. At Camp McLean, Guglielmo Barberis worked with different constraints. The chapel there was newer, slightly larger, with better lighting. He decided to attempt something more ambitious, a full apse ceiling, an Italian specialty, the curved surface where traditionally the most important images were placed. He spent weeks on scaffolding built from camp lumber, lying on his back like Michelangelo, painting the heavens. Not the Renaissance heavens of clouds and angels, but something more austere, more suited to wartime. A dark blue sky, stars emerging slowly, the sense of infinite space above the altar. Other prisoners helped, mixing paints, building the scaffold, standing watch to warn when inspections approached. The work became communal, dozens of men contributing to something none of them fully understood, but all recognized as important. Father McKenna watched the ceiling take shape and felt both pride and worry. The project was technically within regulations. Prisoners were allowed religious practice. Chaplains could decorate chapels. But this was different. This was art. Real art. Created by enemies of the state with government resources. At Fort Bliss, Pietro Bugatti worked alone, refusing help. His approach was darker than the others, more modern. He painted scenes from the Passion, but in sharp angles and abbreviated forms that suggested Cubist influence. The other prisoners found it disturbing. Some complained to Father Walsh. "It doesn't look holy," one said. "Maybe holiness doesn't always look comfortable," Walsh replied. Bugatti painted through his despair, each stroke an argument with God, with the war, with the universe that had brought him here. His images were not meant to comfort. They were meant to witness, to say that suffering had happened, was happening, would continue happening, and beauty could still exist within it. The three camps, Hereford, McLean, Fort Bliss, became known among the prisoners. Men requested transfers to work details near them, hoping for a chance to see the chapels. The art created pride, a sense that Italians could still create something valuable, that their culture had not been entirely consumed by fascism and war. But success drew attention. In December 1943, an inspector from the War Department arrived at Camp Hereford for a routine review. Captain James Hartford was a career military administrator, a man who believed regulations existed for good reasons. He walked through the camp with the commandant, checking supplies, reviewing work details, examining security procedures. The commandant, Colonel William Bass, was proud of his camp. Low escape attempts, good relations with local farmers, prisoners who worked hard and caused minimal trouble. He took Hartford through the facilities, saving the chapel for last. "You'll want to see this," Bass said, opening the chapel door. Hartford stepped inside and stopped. He had been in army chapels across America and Europe. Functional spaces, barely decorated, sometimes just rooms with a cross on the wall. This was different. The walls glowed with images, technically impressive, emotionally powerful. He walked slowly around the space, studying each panel. "Who did this?" Hartford asked. "Prisoners, sir. Italian POWs. The chaplain organized it." "With what materials?" "House paint, mostly. Some supplies donated by church groups." Hartford's expression was unreadable. He was seeing what the others saw, undeniable beauty, genuine artistry. But he was also seeing something else. "These are enemy combatants." "Yes, sir." "Being provided art supplies." "Donated supplies, sir, nothing from military stores." During wartime, Colonel Bass felt the atmosphere shift. "The chaplain felt it was important for morale, sir. Both prisoner morale and our own men. It's made the camp easier to manage." "I'm sure it has." Hartford turned to face him. "Colonel, do you understand how this would look to the public? To families with sons fighting these men's allies?" "The prisoners are cooperating with us, sir. They're working. They're enemies." Hartford's voice was not angry, just firm, the voice of a man who saw complications. "I'll need to file a report." The report traveled up through military bureaucracy with surprising speed. In January 1944, it reached Washington, landing on desks where men made decisions about war policy, propaganda, and public perception. The problem was optics. American soldiers were dying in Italy, fighting the very army these prisoners had served. Meanwhile, those prisoners were in Texas, well-fed, housed, creating art. If news got out, really got out beyond a small newspaper article, it could become a scandal. Congressman Martin Dies of Texas heard about it first from a constituent who had visited Camp Hereford. Dies was chairman of the House Un-American Activities Committee, a man sensitive to anything that might suggest sympathy with enemy powers. He requested a full investigation. The War Department responded carefully. A memorandum was circulated to all POW camp commandants. Prisoners of war may be provided materials necessary for basic religious practice. Materials for decoration or artistic embellishment are not authorized and should not be permitted. At Camp Hereford, Father O'Connor received the order from Colonel Bass. They sat in the commandant's office, the memo between them on the desk. "They're shutting it down," Bass said. O'Connor stared at the paper. "The painting is finished anyway. Not just painting, they're asking questions about all the camps. They want to know what other embellishments prisoners have been allowed. It's religious art, Colonel, for religious practice." "I know that, Father, and you know that, but to someone in Washington reading reports, it sounds like we're coddling the enemy." O'Connor felt anger rising, unusual for him. These men are creating beauty in the middle of hell. They're remembering they're human beings, not just soldiers. Isn't that what we want? What we want doesn't matter. Bass stood, walked to the window, looked out at the camp stretching toward the horizon. What matters is perception, and right now the perception is that we're treating enemy prisoners better than some of our own citizens. At Camp McLean, Father McKenna received similar orders. Guglielmo Barberis had just finished the ceiling, the last stars painted against dark blue. Now McKenna had to tell him it was over. No more painting, no more supplies, no more art. Barberis took the news in silence. Then, carefully, he climbed the scaffold one last time to sign his work. In tiny letters, barely visible, he wrote in Italian, "Guglielmo Barberis, prisoner, painted this ceiling to the glory of God, 1944. At Fort Bliss, Pietro Bugatti responded differently. When Father Walsh told him the War Department had ended the program, Bugatti laughed, a bitter sound that echoed in the empty chapel. "Of course they did, Father. Beauty makes them nervous. It means we're still human, and it's easier to fight enemies who aren't human." "The work you've done will remain," Walsh said. "No one's taking it down. Not yet." Bugatti gathered his brushes, the poor tools he had learned to love. "But they will, eventually. Nothing beautiful survives war." The investigation continued through spring. Congressional staffers visited the camps, took photographs, interviewed chaplains and commandants. They were looking for scandal, for evidence of waste or impropriety. What they found was more complicated. Local communities supported the chapel projects. Church groups that had donated supplies wrote letters defending the chaplains. Farmers who employed prisoner work details testified that the art had made the Italians better workers, more cooperative, less sullen. The chapels, they argued, served American interests by making prisoners easier to manage. But the political pressure remained. Congressman Dies gave a speech on the House floor, carefully worded, never directly attacking the chaplains but questioning whether enemy combatants should be provided with luxuries denied to loyal Americans. The speech was covered by major newspapers, and suddenly the story was national. The War Department responded with new regulations, stricter and more explicit. Prisoners could attend religious services. Chaplains could conduct basic worship. But materials, decorations, and any non-essential embellishments were forbidden. Existing artwork would be allowed to remain, but no new projects would be permitted. Father O'Connor read the new regulations in his quarters, late at night, the Texas darkness pressing against his window. He had done what he thought was right, given men in captivity something beyond survival. Let them exercise the talents God gave them, created spaces of beauty in the midst of ugliness. Now he was being told, politely but firmly, to stop. He walked to the chapel that night alone and stood looking at Copini's work. The Virgin's face gazed back, serene and sad, eternal. Whatever the regulations said, this would remain. The paint had dried, the images were permanent. They had created something that would outlast the war. Luigi Copini learned about the investigation from other prisoners, through the camp's invisible network of gossip and rumor. He was working in the cotton fields when word reached him, picking in the endless rows under the white sun. That evening he returned to his barracks and found Father O'Connor waiting. "I wanted to tell you myself," the chaplain said. "There will be no more painting." Copini nodded slowly. He had expected this, had known it could not last. "The chapel is finished anyway, Father." "Yes, but I'm sorry, for all the other chapels that won't be painted, all the other men who won't have this chance." The Italian looked at his hands, stained and calloused. "In my village there is a church my grandfather painted. Every surface, every wall covered with stories from the Bible. He worked on it for 30 years. When he finished, he was an old man, and no one remembered his name. But the paintings remained. That's a good story. My grandfather said art is not about the artist, Father. It's about the thing created. We painted your chapel. That's enough. The war continued. Italy surrendered in September 1943, but the prisoners remained in Texas, their return complicated by the ongoing campaign against German forces in Italy. They stayed through 1944, through 1945, working in the fields, living in their camps, existing in the strange limbo of peacetime captivity. The chapels remained, guarded, visited, preserved by chaplains who understood what had been created. Soldiers stationed at the camps attended services and found themselves moved by images painted by men who had been enemies. Something unspoken passed between the art and those who viewed it. A recognition that suffering was universal, that beauty could exist in any circumstances, that humanity persisted even in war. In June 1945, the Italian prisoners began returning home. They boarded trains heading east, carrying almost nothing, leaving behind the landscape that had confined and, strangely, sheltered them. Luigi Capini stood at the train window as Camp Hereford receded into the distance, watching the chapel's tin roof catch the morning light. He never returned to Texas. Back in Italy, he resumed painting churches, working quietly, telling almost no one about his time as a prisoner. The war had broken his country, left it divided and humiliated. He focused on restoration, repairing frescoes damaged by bombing, rebuilding what had been destroyed. Guglielmo Barbaris returned to Rome and found his old studio intact, though most of his possessions were gone. He resumed commercial art, painting advertisements and theater backdrops, never mentioning the ceiling he had painted in Texas. His wife asked once about the war years, and he simply said, "I survived." Pietro Bugatti was different. He returned to northern Italy changed, darker, unable to settle. He continued painting, but his style grew increasingly abstract, increasingly difficult. He held one small exhibition in Milan in 1947, showing work that critics found disturbing and powerful. Then he stopped exhibiting, stopped selling, painted only for himself until his death in 1968. The chapels in Texas were eventually decommissioned. Camp Hereford closed in 1946. The buildings sold or demolished, the land returned to agriculture. But the chapel was preserved, moved to a nearby town, maintained by a local Catholic parish that recognized its value. In the 1970s, an Italian journalist researching POW camps discovered the story. He tracked down surviving prisoners, interviewed them, photographed the remaining chapels. The articles he wrote sparked interest. Italian television produced a documentary. American historians began studying the camps more seriously. Luigi Capini was still alive, elderly now, living in his childhood village. The journalist found him and asked about the Texas chapel. "Did you think the paintings would last?" the journalist asked. Capini thought for a long moment. "I didn't think about lasting, I thought about painting. When you're a prisoner, you don't think about the future. You think about the next brushstroke, the next color. The painting was enough. But they did last. Some things last, most things don't. That's not for us to decide." Today, fragments of the Italian POW chapel art remain in Texas, preserved by historical societies and churches. The images are faded now, the crude house paint deteriorating despite preservation efforts, but they can still be seen. The Virgin's face, the Stations of the Cross, Barbaris's ceiling with its dark stars, Bugatti's angular passion scenes. They stand as evidence of something the War Department once worried about, then tried to stop, then finally had to accept, that even in captivity, even in wartime, even in the machinery of conflict between nations, human beings create beauty. Not because it changes anything, not because it matters to the war, but because it matters to them, because it's what humans do.